Hello everyone, and welcome to the 186th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the characters and themes of The Fifth Element. At the time of its release, The Fifth Element was pretty solidly divided between people who absolutely hated it and people who absolutely loved it. I find myself in the latter camp, and over time it would seem that this film has grown on many who discounted it as messy, campy, sci-fi trash to become nothing short of a cult classic. For me, that was always part of its charm. From the outlandish costumes to the stellar performance of Chris Tucker as Ruby Rhod, every bit of scenery and sound in this film go a long way in making this film one of the greatest sci-fi films I've ever seen. For some, it might not be worthy of entering the conversation when it comes to defining what it means to create great sci-fi, but it has charm, wit, a great story, and special effects that hold up extremely well even 27 years after its release. And I'm happy to be speaking about one of my favorite films with all of you in this video. So without further ado, let's begin. The central theme of The Fifth Element is relatively simple. There are forces of evil that are seeking to destroy life in this universe or abuse it for personal gain, and there are forces of good that seek to preserve, maintain, and promote life that work tirelessly to combat those forces of evil. And when it comes down to it, preserving life by whatever means necessary when confronted with entities that wish to destroy it is the only thing that matters. As simple as that mantra is, there's a lot more to it. This story is centered around the efforts of a mysterious and monumental evil that appears every 5,000 years to attempt to use a weapon housed on Earth that's under the care of a caretaker species, the Mondoshawan, to obliterate all life in the universe. And the Mondoshawan are attempting to prevent this from occurring by having the Fifth Element be the trigger for this weapon, rather than this evil force, so it might be kept at bay for another 5,000 years. Now there are a few possibilities here as to why the Mondoshawan chose Earth to house such an important weapon. They may have chosen Earth because Earth is a planet best suited for life to form, because its location was of great importance to the functionality of the weapon, or because it was the latest place the Mondoshawan chose to hide their weapon after its previous location became compromised, which I think is the most likely scenario. It's said that the Mondoshawan arrived on Earth before time was time to store the weapon in a pyramid in Egypt and establish the priestly order that guarded their secrets. And considering there is recorded history 5,000 years prior to the arrival of the great evil in the year 2263, in 2737 BC, the Mondoshawan must have come to Earth at the very earliest in the year 7737 BC, which for us would be a time before time was recorded. An interesting notion to consider here is that the Mondoshawan could have been responsible for providing humanity with the knowledge we required to jumpstart our evolution in this universe, which is something interesting to consider. While the priests of the earthly order were charged with guarding the secrets of the pyramid and the treasures it housed by the Mondoshawan, considering that the weapon activates a divine light that can create and promote life in the universe, I think we can assume that the Mondoshawan didn't necessarily conceptualize the stones or Lilu, but created them after being created themselves by God, who then charged them with creating this weapon to combat the forces that oppose them, as I doubt that any one species is capable of manifesting such an awesome power alone. And when you take into account that the ultimate evil is sentient, it makes sense that there is an opposing greater good that guides the Mondoshawan, just as the ultimate evil guided Zorg, which we'll discuss later on. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, once this weapon was created, the ultimate evil, who I'll refer to as Mr. Shadow going forward, discovered that it could use this weapon itself to amplify its own powers. So the tool that's instrumental in keeping evil at bay became a double-edged sword, a necessity that only provided further proof that such a power is needed to destroy this malevolent force. Fortunately though, the activation of this weapon seems to be a pretty straightforward affair, as all that needs to be done to ensure its activation is the protection of the stones in the Fifth Element until the time when they're needed, and the subsequent activation of them by the Mondoshawan, who are able to return in time to do so every 5,000 years, due to the predictability of Mr. Shadow's arrival. What made this plan not so simple though, were the conditions on Earth in the year 1914. The Mondoshawan arrive in Egypt in 1914 to take the stones in the Fifth Element from Earth, because as they say, war is coming. And while that could mean a war that the Mondoshawan are about to fight on their homeworld or elsewhere, it's more likely that they're referring to World War I, which began in 1914, an event that more than any other war prior to this one would have endangered the weapon's resting place. Not to mention that another global conflict would ravage the world only a few decades later, and would similarly endanger the weapon. While this might not seem like too big of a deviation to this plan, any deviation to any plan invites unexpected occurrences that could endanger it. And that's just what happens when the Mondoshawan attempt to return on time for Mr. Shadow's reemergence. During their journey to Earth, the Mondoshawan are shot down by a violent warrior race of aliens called the Mangalore. And we soon learn that the Mangalore were contracted to do so by one Jean-Baptiste Zorg, who in turn was contracted by Mr. Shadow to perform this task. And because he was contracted by the supreme evil in this universe, we can assume that at the time this story takes place, that he was either the most evil individual in all of the Federated Territories, or the most evil individual with access to the most resources, making him a perfect target for Mr. Shadow. And Zorg, as he's most often referred to, is a self-professed monster of a man. Heading the eponymous megacorporation Zorg Industries, Zorg was afforded the power of a company that seemingly had its hand in everything from weapons manufacturing to taxicabs, a company that employed billions of the 200 billion citizens of the Federated Territories and had significant influence over its economy, and Zorg held within the palms of his hands the power to influence all of it as he saw fit. Clad in an iridescent and high-collared bodysuit, Zorg, with his heavy southern drawl and his futuristic Hitler-esque hair and soul patch, is a colorful and charismatic villain who takes great pleasure in causing pain and misery to others, doing so with confident and snide mannerisms that gives him the nefarious elegance of a man who takes what he wants, when he wants, from whoever he wants to, and gives no further thought to the matter. When asked to fire 500,000 employees from his cab company, he instead ups it to 1 million for good measure. He expresses his appreciation for cold-blooded killers, and he takes great pleasure in killing when given the opportunity to do so. And of course, he's a man who is willing to ally himself with the source of evil itself for a chance at securing himself a nice payout that he undoubtedly had no need for, but that would allow him to put a stranglehold on billions more than he already had. As diabolical as Zorg is though, he's but a representative of evil, and while he's responsible for the suffering of millions, or perhaps even billions of people, the true evil in this story still lies with Mr. Shadow, an entity that is able to entice a man like Zorg, because of course he would jump at the opportunity to enrich himself and cause a bit of destruction in the process. Though that might be the case, Zorg does offer us a bit of his own philosophy that gives us something to ponder. I wanted to play this clip in full for all of you, but the censors weren't having it. So here's what he has to say when Vito accuses him of only wanting to destroy life. Life, which you so nobly serve, comes from destruction, disorder, and chaos. Look at this empty glass. Here it is, peaceful, serene, boring. But if it is destroyed, look at all these little things. So busy now. Notice how each one is useful. What a lovely ballet ensues. So full of form and color. Now think about all those people that created them. Technicians, engineers, hundreds of people who will be able to feed their children tonight, so those children can grow up big and strong and have little teeny tiny children of their own, and so on and so forth, thus adding to the great chain of life. You see, Father, by creating a little destruction, I'm in fact encouraging life. In reality, you and I are in the same business. Zorg is obviously wrong here, but there is some truth to what he's saying. Yes, there are mechanisms that we create in response to destruction in order to prevent, mitigate, or repair the damage that it causes. And while the destruction he creates does create opportunities for others to enrich their lives, and while some of the things his company is responsible for creating do just that, Zorg is primarily in the business of destroying things so he can then enrich himself by solving the problems he's created, and rarely does he personally engage in or promote actions that solve existing issues. So no, Zorg doesn't further the cycle of life with his destructive activities. It only appears that way because he's so adept at manufacturing situations that make it appear that he does. But if we take his philosophy a bit further and apply it to the universe at large, you'll find that there's some more truth to his statement. For the very universe itself is said to have been born from a phenomena that we refer to as the Big Bang. And in the aftermath of this cataclysmic life-giving event, the various gases that swirled around empty space eventually compressed together and exploded in brilliant fusion to form the stars that then birthed all forms of life in the universe. And another example can be found in the circle of life that Zorg claims to contribute to, as when living organisms die and return to the soil, the nutrients from their decomposing bodies provide nutrients to the soil that then promotes the growth of plants, that then feed other organisms, who then die and repeat this cycle infinitely. But those are natural functions of the universe, not atrocities crafted by insidious forces that are looking to either enrich themselves in Zorg's case, or destroy all life in Mr. Shadow's case. And so Zorg's line of thinking here, while having some truth to it, is wholly misguided and wrong. As is often the case though, both Zorg and Mr. Shadow are ultimately defeated, for as much as those allying themselves to evil often cause immense amounts of suffering and destruction, in the end, they're never a match for the fifth element that manages to halt this monumental evil at the climax of this story: love. Now, for most of this story, we're led to believe that Lilu herself is the fifth element, an artificial creation containing 200,000 DNA memo groups that holds the power of life itself within her, which could mean that life is the fifth element. But considering that Lilu required Corbin's love to move past her hesitation at preserving life due to learning about all the atrocities mankind has committed when waging our various wars, it's strongly suggested that love is in fact the fifth element. However, that wouldn't explain how Lilu was able to stop Mr. Shadow 5,000 years earlier without the aid of Corbin's love. But I have a theory for that. The Mondoshiwan had planned to return to Earth to activate the stones and stop Mr. Shadow. But as we discussed earlier, that plan had to be altered, and it was altered further once their ship was destroyed, and Lilu nearly destroyed as well. So if the Mondoshiwan had been able to make it to Earth, they would have been able to activate the weapon using their own love of life. But because that didn't happen, it was up to her to activate the weapon on her own. And with the love of life that the Mondoshiwan fostered absent, she had to discover that love for herself, just as she had to learn so much about humanity after her reformation. And Lilu arrived at a very important question that I'm sure many of us have asked ourselves when investigating the horrors that we inflict upon each other. That being, do we actually deserve to live, considering all the terror we unleash upon the world? And she, with the help of Corbin, was able to discover that the element she embodied, love, was the only reason that she needed to save all life in the universe. I know, love being the answer to defeating evil and the reason for fostering life is extremely corny. But there's a reason that love conquers all has so often been featured as a central theme in countless stories. Because the love of someone or something is what actually gives life its meaning. Why bother defending anything in this world? What's the point in protecting your life, friends, family, pets, or even the lives of people you'll never meet? In fact, why bother doing anything at all? Well, because of love. We help each other and ensure our lives are healthy and prosperous because we love each other. We pursue our passions because we love them, and we work as hard as we do, so at the end of the day, we can enjoy the company of those we love or do the things that we love doing. So is love being the fifth element really such a far-fetched notion? I don't think so. You could argue that procreation, or just life in general, is the true fifth element, as if we treat the fifth element as a function of nature, much like the other four are, and look to the biological functions of sentient life for an answer, you'll find that love isn't a requirement for life to continue, just the act of procreation, as loving another being is not required to create new life. You could even argue that protecting one's offspring isn't derived from love, but the biological drive to continue one's species that necessitates safeguarding them from forces seeking to eliminate them. But if all there was to life was fulfilling our biological prerogatives, we'd be nothing more than machines. Flesh robots who would move through the world only fulfilling our biological programming, whilst ignoring everything else that we consider makes life worth living. Because to truly live life, you have to love being alive, or at the very least, love something that makes you want to keep living. If all that we are biological automatons that are going through our program motions, there would be no need for laughter, no use for camaraderie and companionship beyond the added protection it provides to life. And art, culture, or any of your hobbies and interests would be unnecessary frivolities that only interfere with what our natures require us to do. But because we love, life is worth preserving, despite all that we do to the contrary. And well, if we all loved one another as we should, and if we didn't let some of our nastier instincts rule our actions, then you might just find that evil would cease to exist. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on the fifth element? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.